So, what motivated you to tackle this specific subject, and what methodology did you use to study it? Furthermore, given the highly volatile situation in Iran and the deep uncertainty surrounding the survival of the regime, why did you feel it was essential to take the risk of writing and publishing this book now?
The book was conceived, written, and almost published before the events. That means the last war, which is now in its fourth week, was not included in the book. Of course, at the last moment, I added a few pages to it, but the topic is the nature of the Iranian political system and the way society reacts to repression and to this totalitarian regime, which is original, because in contrast to what might be called classical fascism, the Iranian regime is a kind of powerless fascism. It is fascism because everything is decided at the top. When Ayatollah Khamenei was alive, he played a major role. Now it is mostly the army of the Revolutionary Guards which decides, so that society cannot have a voice. And elections and all those political apparatuses are there, working in a kind of void. They don't exist independently of the army of the Revolutionary Guards. But it is a kind of totalitarian regime, but the major difference with classical fascism is that society can express its discontent through social protests. Of course, they are repressed heavily. Lots of people, killed, tortured, put in jail. But the regime, up to now at least, has not been able to prevent social protest. If we compare it, let's say, with North Korea, we see the major difference. Both are totalitarian, but the Korean regime has been so far successful in preventing any kind of protest. In Iran, social protests have been a kind of routine since at least 2009. And the methodology is based on giving some kind of privilege to social protest movements. I belong to a sociological school which deals mainly with social movements. And Alain Touraine was my sociological inspiration. And Michel Dievorka and the others are his followers, disciples. And in a way, I can say I am at least partially following the way Touraine analyzed social movements and their place in, let's say, societies, political system, social system, cultural system, economic system, and so on. So the methodology is mainly giving some kind of privilege to social movements and to what I call, daily life in society and the dealings between society at large and the political system. I give you an example, for instance, corruption. Corruption is a phenomenon which is known to everybody. In every society you have corruption. But the problem is that in Iran, corruption was part of the political system. That means the regime, for instance, prohibited the selling of alcoholic beverages, but the regime itself imported alcohol and sold it at the black market to the people. And when people were arrested, the same alcohol was confiscated and then put again, at the disposal of the buyers through the black market. I give you this example, for instance, drugs and many other items like the system to catch, TV channels outside Iran belong to the same category. That means the government prohibits them, but then the Guardians of the Revolution, who have at least 7 ports that are autonomous, bring them illegally to Iran and then sell them at a much higher price than the international price and get enriched individually, the heads, the hierarchy of the Guardians of the Revolution, and of course then for the sake of the army itself, financing it. So it is a kind of political system in which repression is not only based on, let's say, preventing people from expressing their discontent. It is based on using every item in daily life in order to enrich the regime and to prevent society from expressing its own wishes. Then you have other ways of repression through through jailing, the carceral system. Tens of prisons, are undeclared in Iran, and the whole system is based on just putting in jail people who express their discontent. For instance, in the last social movement, thousands of people were jailed, tortured, in these prisons, some of which are not officially known to the authorities. And there is another way of repressing society, and that's what I call environmental repression. The army of the Revolutionary Guards, for instance, has been building up hundreds, more precisely, more than 640 dams whose utility is open to question. And in most cases, the result has been desalinization of the underground and peasants being unable to use their own ground and then coming to the towns and finding no job. So that this side too is very important in the Iranian case. And then these dams were, of course, built because the Guardians Revolutionary Army was paid in hard currency, in dollars, by the government. And so they found occasions of getting richer and richer as an institution, so that the Revolutionary Guards are not only a military institution, it's a kind of mafia, huge mafia which dominates the Iranian economy. And so my view was to show the interaction between civil society and this political system, which is highly repressive in almost every aspect. And the other one was the culture. I tried to show that the political regime, this regime is based on mourning, crying, and so on, martyrdom, and so on. So this view is not shared by the society. Young people want to live, and they oppose a kind of joy of living to the crying and moaning, by the regime's political elite, which is totally disembodied in terms of social. And I added up a few pages to this book at the beginning of this war because I saw that it was dysfunctional. During the January 2026 protest movement, President Trump promised to help, and he didn't do it. And then his military intervention with the Israelis was more than a month after the movement was repressed. If they had intervened at that moment, it would have, in a way, encouraged people to come to the streets and to protest against the regime and to weaken it. But they didn't do it. They did it after the movement was repressed. So after a huge, massive repression, you cannot have people coming out again and protest against the political system, which has been able to totally repress the movement. And bombing people, from above without intervention of an army at the ground, the army that would intervene with soldiers on the ground, in order to dislodge the political system prevailing in Iran. So without that, just by bombing from the air, does not change the political system in Iran. So the whole build-up of these attacks were, from my viewpoint, useless. And even in a way, one can say it has reinforced the regime. Of course, it has destroyed a lot of the infrastructure and so on, and the nuclear system in Iran, but it can be rebuilt, and the regime is nowadays much more prone to get the nuclear bomb because it knows that it is very important for it to survive. In order to survive, if the regime has a nuclear bomb, then nobody will attack it the way it was done by Israel and the United States. So that it might promote, paradoxically, the nuclear fabrication of the bomb in Iran, in spite of the fact that lots of infrastructure has been destroyed. That's why, my personal view is that the last attacks by the Americans and the Israelis is totally dysfunctional in terms of changing the political system. The whole system remains unchanged, and the attacks, against it by just bombing from the air does not, change the nature of the government, and the government will be there. This repressive political system will not undergo any kind of change.
Okay. For the second question. In your book, you discuss figures such as Reza Pahlavi and Mir Hossein Moussavi as potential leaders, noting that a new leader is currently more likely to emerge from outside Iran than from within. Based on this premise, what realistic and viable political options exist for Iran today, and what form of government could potentially emerge if a transition were to occur?
In the last social movements in Iran a few months ago, the name of Reza Pahlavi was mentioned by the protesters. and around 17% of the slogans, dealt with Reza Pahlavi, so that they called him to come and to defend them against the regime. I'm not saying he's good or bad at it, but it is a social fact that parts of the Iranian society, would like him to come back because he embodies the, let's say, the golden age of the Shah's regime, in which middle class people were prosperous. Now middle class people are squeezed in Iran, and you have more than perhaps half of the population which is below the poverty line, whereas during the Shah, the percentage was much lower than that. And so the entire Pahlavi regime has been shrouded in a kind of, let's say, mythical view of a golden age. And so people asked him to come. And he has shown some kind of leadership, but I do not take sides. I don't say he is good or bad. I'm saying within Iran, there have been many young people who have called him to come. That's it. And when it comes to Mir Hossein Moussavi, he is too old. He is ill. I've read he has some cancer. And he is unable to lead any kind of transitional government because of his illness and of his health, which is not in good shape. So that the only person who was quoted by the protesters as an alternative to the regime was Reza Pahlavi. I'm not sure he is able to deal with the complexity of the situation if he has the opportunity to come back to Iran and replace the regime. But still, as a sociologist, for me, it's important to say that he has been called for by at least part of the protesters in Iran. The Israelis would like him to come, push him towards a regime change. But the Americans, Trump doesn't seem to be interested in that. He would have liked to deal with the regime. It is easier for him. He would like to, in a way, reenact, what he has done in Venezuela. I'm not sure that it will be possible. Because of the mistrust that exists between the Iranian regime and the United States. And there are lots of works nowadays done, CNN, BBC, and other social critics who say that Trump changes his views every day and contradictory ones, and so that it's very difficult to trust him in any respect once it comes to treaties or to discussions and to finding ways of putting an end to the war. So that's, as a sociologist, my view of the situation. And of course, most of those people who protest, who have been active during the last decade in Iran, have been young people, many of them from the universities. Because in Iran there is a paradox. You have more than 4 million students, and they are very important in social movements, in social protests, because they are asking for more democracy, less repression, more joyful daily life, and not crying, moaning, and having the impression that martyrdom should lead the way of life in the country. And in that respect, I think it is a generation that is more motivated in protesting and in putting into question the regime than the older generations.
So, you dedicate a significant portion of your analysis to Iranian youth, a generation that has no memory of the Shah and is now demanding individual and political freedoms, which highlights a profound disconnect with the government. Could you elaborate on the exact role this youth play today? You also mention a paradox. The population is large enough to spark protests but lacks the vigor to overthrow the regime. What exactly is the missing piece, quote unquote, for a successful transition? And finally, how would you explain the historical reversal whereby the street, once a firm supporter of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, has now become its main adversary?
Mm-hmm. I begin with the last part of your question. What the protesters lack is organization. Whenever they try to build up a kind of nucleus of an organization, it is being repressed. The regime knows how to repress, how to kill, how to maim, how to torture, and in that respect, when a social movement, occurs in the country, it is in spite of its vigilance. The regime tries to prevent it, but through internet, through social media, through WhatsApp and the other means, young people gather some kind of momentum and fight against the regime, but they cannot have any kind of organization that would back up and give coherence to the social protest. And we know that this is one of the major problems of these social movements. The more so as once a social protest, occurs, the regime turns off the internet. Doesn't work anymore. And now, for more than a month, Iran has not had internet, cannot use, internet, and that's catastrophic, even for the economic enterprises, who need internet, who need the web in order to communicate. So that's one of the major reasons, and that's the reason why if someone has to replace the regime, he cannot emerge from within Iran due to the repression, due to the fact that he will be arrested and put to death. And that's outside Iran that it should happen. And Reza Pahlavi is one case in point. He is living between Paris and New York, between the United States and France, and he tries to organize a kind of opposition, but it has its own deficiencies, and he seems unable to unify the entire opposition, under his own wings, his own view of society. But at any rate, it is an undecided situation because social protest occurs in Iran very often. At the same time, it is powerless to put an end to this regime based on very efficient repressive apparatus. And we know there are many apparatuses. The whole system, people who are, of course, official members of the government, of the Revolutionary Guards, but you have unofficial people, who are the more repressive, who can kill, maim, and torture because they have no official belonging. They are just financed. It's a kind of mob, organized mob that kills and maims people. And that's why, first of all, young people are very important, because the older generations have to take care of the economic daily life. And since the middle classes in Iran are squeezed, daily life becomes the economic side of the daily life within an inflationary system, very difficult to tackle. And so they do not take part anymore in social protests. That's the younger generation does it. And up to now, they have not been able to overthrow the government, but the government has not been able to stop them from, organizing protests, spontaneous ones, and then spreading all over society, and then being repressed by killing massively people. For instance, the January 2026 movement was repressed in 2 nights with many thousands of people killed in 400 towns in Iran. That means almost everywhere. And that's the paradox, the Iranian paradox, the inability of the regime to stop movement, and the inability of the protesters to overthrow the government. And this kind of inability, now we see it in another way between, let's say, Trump and the American army on the one side and the Iranian one on the other side. Neither can claim victory. The American army is by far stronger. There's no common denominator. It's 100 times stronger, but cannot put an end to the Iranian army because of its own limitations. Iran, for instance, blocks the Strait of Hormuz, and then the price of oil goes up. American consumers are not happy, and he is put under pressure politically within the American society for his mismanaging, the whole system, because many Americans do not approve him for the war he initiated against Iran. So it's a kind of, here too we have a dilemma. Iran cannot impose its will to the Americans or to the Israelis. They cannot impose it. It's a kind of deadlock. And this sort of deadlock seems to be a new way of dealing with problems in our world. And unless something exceptional happens, I'm not sure that the regime will be overthrown by the Americans. And even if they find a kind of, I would say, modus vivendi between them, it won't be a radical one. And so the whole system will be going on one way or another through this sort of inability to find real solutions to the situation in Iran. And my guess is that both sides have their own limitations. And on the Iranian side, repression has been efficient. And on the other hand, many people who are against the regime find that since Iran is attacked by a foreign army by far more powerful and destroys, let's say, the infrastructures, at least partially. For instance, they have destroyed many schools without necessarily being willing to do it. For instance, a school which was destroyed in Minab in southeastern part of Iran, which killed around 170 young, girls, was done because the Americans did not know that close to the army barracks there was a school. So they killed, and then and that killed many young people who had nothing to do with the war. So it was civil society. And in that respect, one can say there is a kind of unresolved situation, and it is partially due to, of course, to the American political system in which, the most powerful economically, militarily, and socially system in the world is ruled by someone whom some people characterize as a kind of lunatic person, who is not necessarily, totally normal. I'm not saying that he is crazy, but he has problems in decision making. He is narcissistic. He is very much, influenced by what is called his inner voice, and this too leads to the kind of world we are living in which Europe is nowadays more and more alienated towards the United States, and vice versa. And my guess is that Iran is a specific case within a general framework, and that's, for instance, in a way, the same problem with Ukraine. You see how it works. By giving the Russians the ability to sell their oil in order to, to push down the price of oil, Americans finance Russia's war against Ukraine, which is somehow, immoral, or at least felt on the European side as being totally dysfunctional.
The title of your book suggests that the end of totalitarianism is near. You argue that although the regime exhibits totalitarian traits, it never fully became totalitarian because it failed to control its citizens' thoughts and feelings, instead acting as a quote-unquote killjoy against their basic human desire to live freely, dance, and sing. How did you arrive at this conclusion? Furthermore, although there is a total loss of social support for the government, the population seems powerless against state violence. How would you interpret the intensification of repression that we have witnessed recently, particularly in 2026? Are these the desperate signals of a regime in its final agony?
My guess is that I've already given some answers to this last question, but my book, is the end of totalitarianism with a
Question mark?
with a huge question mark.
Mm-hmm.
In that respect, I'm not sure that it will be the end of it. And at the end of the book, I say that the way, American and Israeli intervention in Iran has developed shows that the regime will survive. My guess is that the regime will survive, at least in the short term, because the attacks unify society, feels it has to back the regime because it is an aggression from the outside world without any kind of perspective for the end of it. So that they have no choice, either being passive, doing nothing, or supporting the regime in order to put an end to the war. That's my major conclusion. That is not the end of the regime, but in a way it's survival. Because, in part, of this war, undeclared war, because it was not declared and the American Congress was not aware of it, I mean, or did not accept it up to now. It takes 3 months, I guess, before they can intervene. So it's not yet 3 months, and the war continues. But internationally, many political scientists say it is illegal, in a way. So there is no way through this war to put an end to this regime, and it will not. It will survive at least during the war. As for my guess about how it will unfold, as I said, it is an open situation, and the mistrust between Iran and the United States is huge. The Iranian side does not trust the American because President Trump can change, his scenario, in a blinking of an eye, so that it is not a stable, or at least perceived as not being a stable treaty that could be concluded between Iran and the United States. And I hope both sides will have some kind of, clear-sightedness, and then they will accept some kind of compromise to end the suffering of the people, because it is not anymore a war based on rational choices. Clausewitz, who is a major strategist of war, says that wars are another way of leading politics. In this respect, one can say there is no possible, reasonable translation of politics, through this war. And if there is some, it needs a minimum trust between the two belligerents, and I'm not sure that the trust exists. So that it might end, but it might begin at any other moment, because both sides believe that only through cheating one can achieve some kind of victory. For the Iranian regime, the survival of the regime is much more important than society's well-being. It is a regime which is based on that. And in that respect, through repression, up to now at least, has been successful in putting an end to social protests within Iranian society.
Thank you very much for
You're
this
welcome.
interview.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Avec plaisir.